Hey guys, welcome back to the lecture series. So I'm going to tell you right now, we're covering chapters 2 through 4. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on chapter 1 because we talked a lot about that on Zoom. And I'm trying to keep these lectures under 15 minutes, so it's probably stupid for me to wait for 4 chapters to go over all this stuff. But I do have a little bit of something on chapter 1. And it's just the green light, okay? And I think I mentioned this on Zoom too, but it's just a friendly reminder that this is going to be a big symbol in The Great Gatsby, okay? So I do want to move on to chapter 2, and a lot of you mentioned the Valley of Ashes in your discussion boards, which I think, or not discussion boards, your flip grids, which I think is great. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Valley of Ashes. And a lot of you mentioned it's desolate, it's out of sync with the East Egg and the West Egg. This is basically where American dreams die, which I know sounds very morbid, but it's kind of the truth, okay? The only lasting business in the Valley of Ashes seems to be George and Myrtle Wilson's garage, okay? You'll learn about a diner that's nearby pretty soon, but the big thing that stands out in the Valley of Ashes, besides all of this ash gloominess environment, is this billboard of T.J. Eckelberg's glasses. Okay, so basically it's this optometrist that had wanted to set up a business. We infer in the Valley of Ashes that maybe failed, or he moved because he wasn't generating enough business. But it's interesting that these eyes are still looking out at the Valley of Ashes. And it's worth considering why. Why is this the place that these eyes are so focused on? Okay, so again, Valley of Ashes, think loss of dreams, think lack of opportunity. A lot of you guys are bringing up this idea of the American dream being an equal opportunity for people to pursue those dreams. Obviously, we have the Wilsons who are still trying to pursue those dreams, but they seem to be failing, right? Poor George Wilson, has that glimmer of hope when he sees Tom and Nick come to the auto shop, only to be torn down by Tom's snide remarks and his intimidation, right? So we learn a little bit about that. We meet Myrtle. Before that, I do want to jump back to the train. So Tom and Nick are on this train, right? And Nick mentions that this train stops at certain points, not exactly planned, okay? And so it's not like they're stopping at a specific train stop. It just kind of stops on the way there. And Tom literally grabs Nick and jumps out of the train, okay? And Nick's a little annoyed by this, right? He's kind of like, what? I don't have anything else better to do on a Sunday. But this is the thing about Tom Buchanan. He doesn't have any sort of consideration for anybody else's day, okay? Everybody lives to entertain and serve Tom Buchanan. That's his way of thinking, okay? So he jumps off, they go over to the garage, and Tom even says, hey, I want you to meet my new girl, which again, totally inconsiderate. Daisy is Nick's second cousin, okay? Or no, cousin twice removed, whatever, okay? So even that is a lack of consideration on Tom's part. So we meet Myrtle, and one of the things that Nick attaches to Myrtle is this idea of vitality. Okay, and I bring that up because Fitzgerald used that word also in Winter Dreams. So it's really worth looking and thinking about what vitality means and why he's attaching it to Myrtle twice, okay? So he says that she had this vitality when he first meets her. The second time he mentions it in this chapter is when that vitality leaves in New York and is replaced with this hoidiness, right? Which again, some of you discussed in your flip grids, okay? That there's this stark transition, right? She's this woman that has this vitality, this strength, right? She's wanting something, she's wanting to create something, and then she moves over into New York City with Tom momentarily, and her attitude completely changes because she's surrounded by money and wealth, okay? At one point, she even says that she asked the bellboy or whatever to go get ice, and she couldn't believe that he hadn't brought it yet, okay? As if she has any right to be put on airs, right? She works at an auto garage, okay? The auto garage is failing, right? But she has this different perception of herself when she's with Tom, as she's with Tom's mistress, okay? She wants to be Daisy Buchanan, okay? Which is why she kind of feeds Tom, right? When she's like, Daisy, Daisy, Daisy. And all she gets is a punch in the face from Tom. Okay, so again, I jumped a little bit too quickly there. So we meet Myrtle. One of the things I want to pose, okay, and this is just something I want you all to think about, is how should we feel towards Myrtle Buchanan? Do we feel sorry for her? Do we just think she's a complete jerk because she abandons this vitality? Like, what are your thoughts on her? And I'll tell you my personal opinion when we Zoom tomorrow. So we go to this New York apartment that Tom has specifically bought to have his affairs, which is terrible, okay? And we meet the McKees, and we also meet Myrtle's sister, Catherine, okay, who she tries to fix Nick up with. So the McKees, Mr. McKees, this photographer, we see kind of some interesting intricacies between the relationship between him and his wife, which again is also worth noting and analyzing. How is marriage conveyed in this novel so far, okay? How do men treat their wives and wives treat their husbands? Something to think about. The party, right? Nick says this is only the second time in his life that he's ever been drunk. Okay, and all this stuff happens. And I want to go back to Myrtle because I put this idea YOLO, right? You only live once. And the reason I bring this up is because she mentions this idea when she first meets Tom. Okay, she's talking about how she met Tom on the subway and he's making moves on her and she's like, I know I should have called an officer, right? And she's kind of joking around, but she takes the opportunity to have this affair with Tom and says, you can't live forever, you can't live forever. So that's how she justifies having this affair with Tom. And even Catherine mentions early on that this is the first sweetie she's ever had with, while still being married to George, as if it's acceptable to be having affairs during this time. Catherine also mentions that Tom and Myrtle can't stand the people they're with, but Tom serves this excuse to Myrtle that he can't divorce Daisy because she's Catholic. Meanwhile, Nick's saying, she's not Catholic. So it's interesting that he construes this lie. And later we see the reason he construes this lie is because ultimately he doesn't want to leave Daisy. Okay, he seems to love Daisy because he ends up punching Myrtle in the face. So the other thing that I want you to note about Tom's actions, we have two pretty aggressive actions that he does within the first two chapters, right? The first one in chapter 1 is when he slams that window down, right? Jordan and Daisy are enjoying themselves. They're getting a nice breeze and he just slams it down, okay? So that's his authority because of his wealth, okay? He has the power to end things. Think about that, okay? And then same thing with this, he doesn't want to hear about Daisy. He doesn't want the reminder that he might be doing something wrong. So instead of being diplomatic about something, he just punches Myrtle in the face because he can. So remember this about Tom Buchanan's character. He does things because he can do these things without any sort of consequence, okay? Morally or otherwise. All right, so I think that was all I wanted to cover on chapter 2. Chapter 3. So now we get to meet Gadsby. And again, this is interesting too. We actually don't meet Gadsby until the 3rd chapter. And we're introduced to Gadsby's parties first, okay? How they're created, who ends up showing up, okay? And we know that there are hordes of people that come from both East Egg and West Egg to these parties, right? And I want you to think too, what does this say about society, right? Because Nick even mentions he's the only one that has received an actual invitation to attend this party, okay? Everybody else is just word of mouth. They're showing up, okay? And he even mentions that they conduct their behavior as if they're in an amusement park, all right? The other thing too, here's this guy who's opening up his home. Remember, prohibition's going on during this time. He has loads of booze that he's giving away freely. Okay, he's being a pretty generous host, and all these people can do is gossip about him, right? They say that he's killed a man. They say that he's bootlegging. Like any sort of rumor they can create about Gadsby, they just throw on out there without, again, any consideration to his character. And more than half of these people haven't even met him. Okay, so there's this idea of gossip, okay, and why these people generate this gossip over this overly generous host. So poor Nick is hanging out at this party all by himself. He's getting more and more drunk until, lo and behold, he runs into Jordan Baker. And we start to learn a little bit more about Jordan Baker. She's, you know, talking to some of the people that she's seen at Gatsby's parties before, da-da-da-da-da. And then later, Nick and Jordan end up going to the library, right? And it's in the library that they meet this guy, Owl Eyes. That's my really poor attempt of an owl, by the way. Yeah, it's very poor. Okay, but we meet this guy, Owl Eyes, which, again, very interesting. We've got this character wearing these spectacles, right? And he doesn't necessarily call out Gatsby, but a little bit, right? Because he mentions these books. He's really impressed with these books that Gatsby has because they're real. And I know that might sound kind of weird to some of you guys, but think about when you go to a furniture store like IKEA or even, you know, Macy's, whatever, and they have their little presentations and they've got like the cardboard books that are together so you can't actually sit and read while somebody is looking at furniture. Anyways, it's kind of obnoxious. So that's what people would do at this time. They would just kind of have it as a decoration. But he actually has real books in his library. And Owl Eyes thinks that's so cool. And he's like, but he knew when to stop. He knew when it'd be too much. And he doesn't cut the pages. So what that means, back then, when you received a book, the pages were stuck together. So you had to cut each one individually. Basically, it's just reading through it. So what he's recognizing here is that these books haven't been opened. They haven't been read. So it's not that he's having books in his library to read them. It's just for show. So think about what that might represent, right? There's kind of this hollowness attached to this idea of just having these books for show. But think about what that hollowness might be representing. So we learn a lot from Owl Eyes, which is kind of ironic because Owl Eyes is blitzed, right? He even ends up being in one of the the only drunk driving accident in the novel, right? This guy is like coming out of his car and he's like, I have the steering wheel. How did this happen? Right? And Owl Eyes is just like, I don't know. Okay. So even though he's hammered, he sees this quite clearly. Okay. Which again is kind of ironic given his state. So also think like, we have two identities using these glasses, right? And glasses obviously are meant to make us see clearer. So think about what these two characters, if you will, are seeing that the rest of society is not. What else did I want to get into? Okay, so they meet Owl Eyes. Nick ends up meeting Gatsby, right? And there's this familiarity that they notice, and it's because they served in the war together and that had seen each other. So Nick is also very embarrassed because he's like, I don't know who the host is. And Gatsby's like, oh, old sport, it's me, right? So he feels bad that he doesn't even recognize the host. But meanwhile, how is he supposed to even know the host in the first place? So we do see this kind of moral attribute about Nick Carraway. Gatsby gets called away. Jordan ends up being called to talk to Gatsby. And then later on, things kind of shuffle off. Nick starts to talk to the audience about what he did after the party. And we end up learning a little bit more about Jordan Baker, right? Because they start hanging out. I think that's what you guys call it these days, hanging out. Okay, and he starts to learn about how he remembered Jordan Baker, because he mentions in the first chapter that she was very familiar and he knows that he had seen her in articles and magazines and so on and so forth. And then he realizes that she had been accused of cheating in her golf game. And he mentions this dishonest aspect about Jordan's character, okay? Which is also kind of annoying because, ladies, I don't know about you, but this really ticks me off. It said, Fitzgerald says something along the lines of dishonesty is something incurable that you can't blame on a woman. Don't take that. I think that's so aggravating, but I'll leave that for now because that's going to be longer than a 15-minute lecture. So we find out about Jordan's dishonesty. The other thing that Nick identifies about Jordan's character is that she's careless, right? She's a terrible driver. And she says, well, I can be a terrible driver because there are going to be other people who do care. So they'll care about my careless actions and I won't get in an accident. And she says, that's why I like you, right? To Nick. And Nick sees this and he kind of just accepts it, right? He keeps rolling with Jordan, even though he knows she's dishonest and he knows that she's careless. So I haven't obviously had a chance to read your discussion boards yet, and I'm very interested to see what you guys think about Nick's honesty, whether you agree or disagree. Because I'm not sure whether some of you caught this at the end of chapter 3. Nick mentions these love letters that he's been sending to this woman back in the Midwest. Okay, and he's starting to feel guilty about that because things are starting to grow between Jordan and Nick. So maybe he's rationalizing that he's still honest because he hasn't technically cheated on the woman that's back at home yet. Or maybe he still just is a little bit, I don't want to say disoriented, but delusional about who he really is. So again, food for thought, kind of interesting, just in case anybody missed that. All right, chapter 4. I think I am making awesome timing. Way to go, me. So here, I'll move my legs because I'm not sure if you guys can see. So chapter 4 starts off with a list of all the names of people that start coming to Gatsby's party, right? And Nick starts to list names from East Egg and West Egg. Meanwhile, what's really interesting, he mentions this in chapter 3, the guests at East Egg and West Egg do not mingle. Like, they are severely segregated, okay? They have their social status and they stick to it, okay? But they'll all come to this one guy's party. So it's worth, again, asking, why does he list these names at the beginning of this chapter? What's the big deal? That's going to be a question we're going to answer at the end of the novel. So he ends up having this conversation with Gatsby. Gatsby comes to pick him up in his Rolls Royce, right? Really nice car. And they start going to New York City together. And Gatsby is telling Nick this story of his life, basically his life story. And Nick isn't really taking the bait, right? He even says at one point that the story was so overly practiced that it had grown threadbare. Okay, so he's like, this is ridiculous. Like, he knows that there's a made-up story here. And even at one point, he tells Nick that he's from the Midwest, and Nick says where? He goes, oh, San Francisco. Okay, so he just says it right off the bat without even thinking, because let's be real. San Francisco isn't in the Midwest, it's in the West, okay? And for a guy that supposedly went to Oxford, okay, he ought to know general geography, all right? So he's not really taking the bait. And it isn't until he shows a picture of him at Oxford that Nick starts to believe in Gatsby's story. Okay, even prior to that, he says that he won or didn't win, I'm sorry. He earned a medal at Montenegro, right, when he fought the war. And he's like, even the medal seemed to look real, but I didn't really believe in it. Okay, so he's finally coming around to Gatsby towards the end of this conversation with the picture at Oxford, okay? But there's still kind of this tension between him and Gatsby. And whether it's because of this wealth factor that Gatsby has or something else, we're not quite sure yet. The other thing I want to mention, because a lot of you were saying this in your flip grids, Nick is not rich. Nick is now middle class. He came from a wealthy upbringing, yes, okay, but he does not have the same benefits as Tom or Gatsby, okay? He even says at the beginning of the chapter that his house in West Egg is a slum, okay? He's actually renting it from somebody, and he has like this Finnish cook or something like that that helps him around chores with the house. But he's totally middle class, so just keep that in mind. So he's a little bit suspicious about Gatsby, and they do drive through the Valley of Ashes. And again, he mentions this vitality that's connected to Myrtle Wilson. He says that he could imagine Myrtle Wilson standing at the gas pump with this vitality, maybe to keep this dream going. Okay, to me, I find it kind of interesting that she's by the gas pump and he's linking this to the vitality, okay, almost as if she's trying to give gas to the American dream. That's my interpretation. You're welcome. So we have this vitality. There's also this really interesting idea about, I think it's the Brooklyn Bridge that they're going over into New York City. And it's like every opportunity is open when they go over this bridge, okay? And I am actually going to be posting that specific page, and I want you to analyze it and add that on to your reading quiz, that dialectical journal that I assigned for you guys. That's going to be probably 10 points of your quiz, okay? So I'll write actual directions about that later on in the messages. So they get into New York, and we get introduced to this guy, Meyer Wolfsheim, okay? And Wolfsheim is kind of all over the place. He's pretty inconsistent, right? First, he's talking about having a connection, if you will. Okay, then he talks about how his best friend got shot outside the Metropole, who's actually a real person. Rosie Rosenthal, okay, is actually a person, so it's an illusion. Then he talks about Gatsby's character. He talks about the molars that's on his cufflinks, which is kind of creepy. Okay, he's not a dentist, FYI. And he's just all over the place. And he says some really ironic things about Gatsby, right? That he knows that he's an Oxford man, and he's the type of guy that he'd introduce to his sister and his mom, and he would never cheat on somebody with their wife, so on and so forth, which again is a little bit ironic that Wolfsheim admires these qualities, supposedly, that he sees in Gatsby. Meanwhile, we find out that he's a gambler, right? He fixed the 1919 World Series, so he's not a very honest man. The fact that his best friend got shot outside of one of his favorite bars is a little bit concerning, okay? So Gatsby says he's a gambler. We as readers can probably infer that he's a gangster, okay? So the fact that Gatsby rolls with this dude is also a little bit suspicious and somewhat worrying. So after they're talking to Myra Wolfsheim, Nick notices Tom Buchanan, right? And he introduces Gatsby very quickly. Then he moves on to meet Jordan, okay? And even this, so Gatsby knows that Jordan and Nick are meeting, and he uses this to his advantage because he wants Jordan to ask Nick if he can borrow his house to host tea with Daisy, okay? And here we start to learn the story about Gatsby and Daisy. All right, so we know early on that Jordan and Daisy are both from Louisville, Kentucky, right? Daisy mentions that in chapter 1, that that's where they spent their white girlhood. And Daisy is infatuated with Gatsby and vice versa, right? And Jordan even mentions that, right? That there's this jealous quality of what Daisy has with Gatsby at a very early age. And so we learned about their romance, how Gatsby gets shipped off to war, and then when he's at war, Daisy ends up getting engaged and marrying Tom Buchanan from Chicago. Now, granted, remember, Daisy does try to go see Gatsby before he leaves, and her parents will not let her. So remember, this, I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this. This value that Daisy has or attaches to money is something she's always been raised with. And her parents wouldn't really let her see things any other way. So she ends up being the dutiful daughter and marrying Tom Buchanan. However, the night before the wedding, she receives this letter from Gatsby, right? And she gets drunk, okay, refuses to marry Tom Buchanan. Jordan and Daisy's mom have to put Daisy in a cold bath to get her sober, and she's clutching, she's hanging on to that letter to Gatsby so hard, even in the shower. And Jordan even says that it came apart like snow, right? And we think about what sort of symbolism we can attach to snow, this idea of innocence and purity, right? This innocent quality, right? This innocent whitehood, okay, that Daisy mentions earlier is gone, right? It's gone as soon as she has to marry Tom Buchanan, which is kind of sad, okay? And again, we start to feel a little bit of empathy for Daisy because that sucks. So Jordan tells this story, and one of the things that Jordan or Nick mention, we're not quite sure who, because we know Nick is learning this story from Jordan, but it seems to be conveyed through his own words, okay? And he mentioned something, that there's something about this voice of Daisy Buchanan's. Okay, we learn about her time living in Chicago, that she ended up not drinking, and therefore she had this very well put together persona that people really gravitated to and noticed. And we start to learn also about the affairs that Tom had very shortly after Daisy and him got married, like honeymoon. He is starting to have affairs on other women. So it's kind of hard not to feel bad for Daisy Buchanan in this chapter, right? And develop some sort of empathy for her. And Jordan ends up being kind of the middleman, right? Organizing this meeting for Daisy and Gatsby, which Nick is kind of annoyed by, but he ends up agreeing to do it anyways. So that's kind of the end of chapter 4. There are a few things that I want you to consider, because tomorrow when we meet for Zoom, I'm going to be throwing all of you questions. So each one of you is going to have to answer at least one of my questions, and that is going to be part of your participation for Zoom that day. Okay, so here's some things I want you to consider. So I've got 4 terms up here: juxtaposition, paradox, synesthesia, and euphemism. Okay, and if you look on my St. Mary's, and again, I'll write this down in my messages too, you'll find figurative language, Great Gatsby, and it has the definitions here. But just to kind of give you a broad brush of what they are, juxtaposition is putting like 2 characters or 2 settings directly next to each other, but they're completely opposite. And the reason the author does that is to show you the contrast. Okay, so I want you to think about how that is seen in The Great Gatsby. Okay, you have a lot of examples of that. Paradox. You're especially going to see this in chapter 5 when you read this for homework tonight. Okay, so paradox is something where it's literal. Okay, something literal is happening. Okay, and figuratively it contradicts what's happening. Okay, so think about literal versus figurative. Synesthesia is using all 5 senses at the same time. Should have an easy time finding that as well. And then a euphemism is basically a way of saying something in a more diplomatic way, I guess, is what I'm looking for. So instead of being like, oh, she's so fat, oh, she's big boned. Okay, so saying things kind of in a more polite way. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this repetition of yellow. Okay, so the color, actually there's a lot of color symbolism in The Great Gatsby. We see it obviously with green, but yellow is mentioned a lot. Okay, so think about that color too, and especially how it might be opposite of what we talked about in Proof Rock, or maybe some similarities with Proof Rock. We talked about Jordan Baker. Meyer Wolfsheim, based off of his assumptions on Gatsby. Do you trust Gatsby? Why or why not? So I want you to think about that too, especially after chapter 4. Okay, so tomorrow we're Zooming, 8:30 a.m. so you guys can sleep in. I'm gonna try to let you guys off by 9 a.m. but we've got a lot to talk about, so it might end up being till 9:30. I highly doubt that. Okay, and as I said, I'm gonna post the quote that I'm talking about from chapter 4 that I want you all to analyze. And I'm pretty sure that is it for me today. I look forward to seeing you guys on Zoom tomorrow. Really miss you guys. Hang in there. Be tough. Be strong. Be safe. Be healthy. Miss you guys. Bye.